Tonight at 10, Theresa May carries out a sweeping cabinet reshuffle, seeking a clear break with the Cameron years.
This is a brutal reshuffle, Mrs May, isn't it? A brutal reshuffle.
The new Prime Minister spent her first full day in office assembling her new cabinet team and wasted no time in making some radical changes. Among those getting prominent roles are Justine Greening at Education, Liz Truss at Justice and the former leadership candidate Andrea Leadsom at Environment. And there are 10 leaving the cabinet, including Michael Gove, Nicky Morgan and John Whittingdale, as Mrs May shakes up Whitehall.
Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Have a great...
There was some boos for Boris on the Foreign Secretary's first official engagement at the French Embassy in London.
It is inevitable that there's going to be a certain amount of plaster coming off the ceiling in the chancelleries of Europe. It wasn't the result that they were expecting, and clearly they're making their views known.
And despite the Brexit concerns, the Bank of England decides to hold interest rates at 0.5%.
And the other main stories on tonight's programme. Out on patrol, we report on policing in the US in the aftermath of protests over the killing of black men.
The yellow jersey is running up the Tour de France.
And trouble at the Tour de France, why Britain's Chris Froome was left running up a mountain.
And coming up in Sports Day on BBC News, Mickelson makes history on day one of the Open at Royal Troon. He shoots an 8-under par 63, the joint lowest round ever in a major.
Very good evening from Downing Street, where Theresa May has sought to make a clean break with the Cameron years by making sweeping changes to the cabinet. No fewer than 10 of Mr Cameron's top team have left, including George Osborne, Michael Gove, John Whittingdale and Nicky Morgan. Throughout the day, there's been a constant flow here of ministers arriving at number 10, including Andrea Leadsom, the former leadership contender who enters the cabinet as Environment Secretary. And as our political editor Laura Kuensberg reports, Theresa May has carried out a much more extensive, some are saying brutal, reshuffle than anyone expected.
Flowers on a day of congratulation, but commiserations too. The busiest people in Westminster today were the florists.
Third time now.
Yeah. Third time?
Yeah.
It's amazing.
But the Prime Minister was cracking on. Arriving for maybe her biggest job, getting her team right. It's not like they even get a job interview. Like Liz Truss, they turn up to find out what they've got. A cosy chat in number 10. Then in her case, they walk out as the new Secretary of State for Justice. Or, like Justine Greening, you walk in with one cabinet post and leave with another. In her case, education. My perfect job, she said, heading straight to her new department.
Are you looking forward to a new position?
I am. I'm absolutely delighted, so looking forward to getting on with the job.
No time to waste with new responsibilities for universities and apprenticeships too. Reshuffles, though, are strange days. Imagine being Damien Green, a senior MP walking up Whitehall, hoping, but not really knowing if you're heading for the cabinet.
Who knows?
Half an hour later, in charge of the Department for Work and Pensions, leaving in the minister's car. But a politician who's had few doubts about his suitability for high office was enjoying his first day.
I've got to zoom out. I've got to zoom in. It's been a very, very busy first day for me here at the Foreign Office, and it began really with a big speech to about 700 of our staff. And I set out what I think that we need to be doing and what we need to be focusing on, and that is reshaping Britain's global profile and identity as a great global player.
So who else is in? Philip Hammond is the Chancellor, essentially the number 2. Amber Rudd is the new Home Secretary. Eurosceptic Andrea Leadsom, who quit the leadership race just days ago, moves into the cabinet in charge of rural affairs. After some confusion over his role, Jeremy Hunt stays at Health. Priti Patel, also part of the Out campaign, is promoted to DFID, the department that runs overseas aid. And Chris Grayling, who ran the Prime Minister's leadership campaign, is now in charge at Transport. Today's losers did not have to face the Downing Street walk of shame. Theresa May told some colleagues in the privacy of the Commons if their services were not required. There are more than a few tweaks around the edges. George Osborne, the Chancellor for 6 years, is out, the biggest casualty. Michael Gove, his controversial friend, was also shown the door. And Nicky Morgan, who backed him to be the leader, met the same fate. Oliver Letwin, one of David Cameron's thinkers, is out as well, along with John Whittingdale, the old Culture Secretary, and Stephen Crabb, who ran for leader too.
This is way more than the usual comings and goings of an ordinary reshuffle. This feels more like a whole new government. Theresa May has taken big, bold decisions, and there's been a no-nonsense clear-out of some of the politicians who are seen by some as a clique around David Cameron and George Osborne.
There are some of the same faces, and some of the same controversies and problems too. But the government looks different, very different. And under Theresa May, what some ministers do will be different too. There won't be a budget within weeks now, as George Osborne had claimed there would.
We don't see any need for an emergency budget at the moment. I expect to make an autumn statement in the usual way, having spent the summer studying the effect on the economy so far, looking at our plan for the future, consulting with the experts, starting with the Governor of the Bank of England this morning.
Remember, these changes are all within the same political party. The same side is still in charge. But the new Prime Minister wants a clean break, maybe clearing old resentments and grudges too. Don't forget, these jobs really do matter. The politics is personal too. Laura Kunzberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, Theresa May's new lineup has not been universally welcomed in other parts of the European Union. The President of the European Parliament, Martin Schulz, said the EU would work constructively with the new British government, but he accused Mrs May of putting party unity ahead of concerns about Britain's future. The French Foreign Minister was rather more forthright, accusing Boris Johnson of peddling lies during the referendum campaign, as our Deputy Political Editor John Pienaar tells us.
Union.
First full day as Foreign Secretary and a few friendly words at the French ambassador's place.
To coin a phrase, toujours plus étroite.
Closer together in English, but they weren't all buying it. Not exactly an angry demo, they seem to quite like him, but Foreign Secretaries aren't supposed to be booed at events like this at all.
Johnson, what would you say to those who are unhappy about you being Foreign Secretary?
Start of the day wasn't perfect either.
Johnson, you're going to stop and have a word?
What about those who've insulted Mr Johnson? Good morning.
Best say nothing, but where was his ministerial car? He'd lost his way when he was after the leadership. Now, to the surprise of many, he's finally found a new role, in charge of quiet British diplomacy, after a career strewn with colourful outbursts and more than a few gaffes. Around the world, there's been some amusement and quite a lot of shock. On Twitter, the former Swedish leader thought it was a joke. The former Belgian Prime Minister did too. British humour has no borders, he wrote. Australia sent good wishes to a good friend, but others in France and Germany were less friendly. And Martin Schulz, President of the European Parliament, has described the cabinet reshuffle which made Mr Johnson Foreign Secretary as part of a dangerously vicious cycle since the vote to quit the EU. The criticism had come pouring down. French Foreign Minister Jean-Marc Ayrault said in an interview the new Foreign Secretary had told a lot of lies about the EU.
After a vote like the referendum result on June the 23rd, it is inevitable that there's going to be a certain amount of plaster coming off the ceiling in the chancelleries of Europe. It wasn't the result that they were expecting, and clearly they're making their views known in a frank and free way. I have to say that the gentleman that you mentioned, the French Foreign Minister, in fact has sent me a charming letter this just a couple of hours ago, saying how much he looked forward to working together.
Here in the UK, this was the reaction of one of Labour's leadership challengers.
They've just made him Foreign Secretary.
In America, they know about Boris Johnson's way with words too. He compared presidential candidate Hillary Clinton to a sadistic nurse in a mental hospital. And during President Obama's British visit, he wrote about what he called the Park Kenyan president's ancestral dislike of the British Empire. In Washington, which also took the losing side against the campaign he led to leave the EU, a State Department spokesman's face spoke volumes.
Secretary has just been announced as Boris Johnson. How do you think...
That's better.
I mean, we're always going to be able to work with the British, no matter who is occupying the role of Foreign Secretary.
Boris Johnson addressed his new staff today, looking the part. That's what diplomacy's about sometimes. Colleagues say he's got the talent and brains for the job, but he'll have to get used to being a little less interesting. John Pienaar, BBC News.
Well, the man who replaced George Osborne as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philip Hammond, says the outcome of the referendum has had a chilling effect on the British economy, but he insisted that the government would do whatever was needed to restore confidence. During the day, the Bank of England surprised the financial markets by keeping interest rates on hold at 0.5%, despite hints that a cut was on the cards. As our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed, explains now.
He was the future once. George Osborne, an austerity budget after austerity budget, a plan that has been religiously followed for 6 years. Today, the new man, Philip Hammond, and a change of tone. Out goes the language of cuts and deficits, in comes the language of reassurance and an economy that works, apparently, for everyone. And on tax, a big message.
Increasing taxes is not the way to support the economy, to maintain consumer confidence and to ensure that we keep on growing our economy in the future. Because if there's one thing that people in this country will want to focus on, it is making sure that the investment in our future continues and the jobs that that investment creates go on being created.
The question on everyone's lips, what is Philip Hammond's agenda? On taxes, as we've heard, he has signalled a keenness there should be no increases. On borrowing, the deficit reduction target has been abandoned. And on trade with Europe, Mr. Hammond insisted Britain was still open for business. Big decisions are ready for takeoff. On airport expansion, Mr. Hammond stayed neutral on a decision that has faced years of delays. On a new nuclear power station at Hinkley Point, the Chancellor was warmer, backing the project.
There is no better signal of being open for business at the moment than infrastructure spending, and we would like to see the aviation capacity recommendations now taken forward. The Davis Commission recommended Heathrow, now just get on with it. The other big project that we would love to see taken forward is HS2. It puts a spine up the middle of the country and also brings growth to regions of the UK, so let's get on with it.
Not getting on with it, the Bank of England, which held interest rates at 0.5% despite worries that the economy is slowing.
The Bank of England certainly surprised the markets and a lot of economists when they said today they wouldn't be cutting interest rates to help stimulate the economy. Well, not yet anyway. And I think that makes an important point. That it's not the governor of this place who is most vital when it comes to the direction of travel for the UK economy. That job is down to the new Prime Minister, the new Chancellor. Their policies will play a much more significant role.
We won't know those details until the autumn statement, and that's months away. Economists say speed is now of the essence.
Businesses are waiting for the government to provide some clarity on how it is going to support the economy, how it is going to affect their plans, and waiting until the autumn statement may be a bit too long.
The bank did warn the housing market and consumer confidence have suffered since June the 23rd and said it was ready to cut interest rates next month if necessary. Whether it feels the need may depend in part on how far Mr. Hammond is keeping his side of the bargain on boosting Britain's economy. Kamal Ahmed, BBC News.
Well, today's cabinet reshuffle could signal a very different approach in some key policy areas, including justice and transport and possibly health services in England. So let's ask three of my colleagues to outline the task ahead in those departments. And let's start with our health editor, Hugh Pym, who's at St Thomas's Hospital in central London.
Yes, Hugh, there was some confusion actually over health policy earlier today with reports that the Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt was moving on. Then it was confirmed he was staying in post. So he will press on with his existing priorities. First of all, imposing a contract on junior doctors in England. He'd reached agreement with the British Medical Association, but then members, junior doctors, voted against. So implementing it may not be straightforward. There's the bigger picture issue of NHS finances, with warnings that some hospitals and other trusts may struggle on their budget and maintain safe standards of care. Longer term, the government's committed to a 7-day NHS in England. It's being made clear that's a manifesto commitment, so the new Prime Minister still sees it as a priority. Mr Hunt has always made clear he loves his job, but he knows it's tough, and it could yet get tougher still.
The new Justice Secretary and the first female Lord Chancellor, Liz Truss, has two big decisions to make. Firstly, does she press ahead with the Prisons Bill, described as the biggest reform of prisons in England and Wales since the Victorian era? The bill which gave prison governors more control, there's more education and rehabilitation, was the brainchild of her predecessor, Michael Gove. It was in the Queen's speech just 2 months ago, but Theresa May is known to have quite a traditional view of prisons. Should that bill now be abandoned? Secondly, the plans to replace the Human Rights Act with a British Bill of Rights. That was in the Conservative election manifesto, but not much has happened on it since. Liz Truss is known to be a big fan of the idea. Should those plans now be speeded up? Well, we've been trying to get answers to those questions this afternoon. Her office haven't been able to give us many clues, perhaps because they're still trying to work out what the answers are.
Well, Chris Grayling comes to the Department of Transport at a time when decisions are pending on two huge pieces of our national transport infrastructure. In the autumn, MPs are due to vote on the first stage of HS2, the high-speed rail link between London and the north of England. Now, that vote could kickstart construction on what could be one of the biggest engineering projects in Europe. And then, of course, there's the controversial issue of airport expansion in the south of England. The government's committed to airport expansion, and last year the Airports Commission recommended a third runway here at Heathrow Airport. Of course, Boris Johnson doesn't like that idea. As for Philip Hammond and Theresa May, well, their views on this recently have been a lot more nuanced, but they do know all the issues around this because they both have constituencies which are close to the Heathrow flight path.
John, thanks very much. John Moylan there at Heathrow, and Daniel Sanford and Hugh Pym, thank you all. Well, the head of the high street retailer Next, Lord Wolfson, who supported the Leave campaign, has told the BBC that big falls in immigration would be dangerous for the economy. He also said that he would not be reducing investment in his business. 3 weeks after the referendum, our business editor Simon Jack has been to Stoke-on-Trent, an area that voted to leave, to assess the impact there on business.
After the intense heat of the European referendum, no city in the UK emerged with more hardened resolve than Stoke-on-Trent. 70% of voters wanted a break with the European Union. That level of certainty at the ballot box has led to uncertainty for one of its most famous businesses. Pottery maker Portmeirion has said it will cut production by 18% this year.
It's the uncertainty within the consumer's mind which is making the retailers think, how much stock should we order? And with the retailers considering how much stock to order, we have to be very careful that we don't just make stock to add it to stock. We're having to pull back just a little bit on our production levels.
The Bank of England has described a vote to leave as a potential economic trauma. You might think of it as a punch on the nose which hasn't started hurting yet. And some would say the governor has been acting and talking as if an economic downturn is imminent or even underway. And yet 70% of people here in Stoke got exactly what they wanted. And many will see this as a reason for optimism rather than concern.
I did vote to stay in, but obviously with the majority vote voting to vote out, there's nothing we can do now. So we just have to sit back and just see what happens, really.
Get on with it?
Yeah.
I think it is what it is. People have spoken, so let's just try and jump at the opportunity to make the best of it.
Come back in 12 months and see, and we'll be there.
Where will we be?
Higher up. Better.
So you're confident we'll be better off?
I voted to come out, and I can't wait for it to happen.
The boss of one of Britain's biggest retailers is also confident.
I think, as with all these things, they're sort of always slightly overdone in the media, and I think most people are sort of taking a calm look at it. I suspect the devaluation of the pound will be much more of a boost to British manufacturing than people are expecting.
But he's concerned that sharp cuts to immigration could harm the economy and rejects the notion that the referendum result makes those cuts inevitable.
I voted leave, and I certainly won't feel betrayed if immigration is not brought down to tens of thousands. I think it'd be very dangerous to bring immigration down to those levels, and I don't think that the majority of people who voted leave are the bigots that London has come to believe that they are. Actually, people want control over their borders, but they don't necessarily want all immigration to stop.
That might be true, but here in the Potteries and elsewhere, many Leave voters hope to combine two things: brighter economic prospects and much lower immigration. Simon Jack, BBC News, Stoke-on-Trent.
Well, back here in Downing Street tonight, our political editor Laura Kuenssberg is with me. Can we talk about the way the government's going to manage this Brexit process, Laura? Split between 3 cabinet ministers. How do we make sense of that?
Well, the short answer here is nobody knows tonight. So we have 3 strong characters: Boris Johnson, Liam Fox, David Davis, all charged with dealing with the difficult, probably the most difficult question for Theresa May as a government: how do we go about leaving the European Union? Which is not just a blank page in terms of how the process will really work, but also a blank page in how the 3 men are expected to work together. Will there be a pecking order, or will they all report directly to Theresa May? How does it work? If Liam Fox is on a visit in Beijing, does he have to phone Boris Johnson if he's in Brussels and ask what they should be saying about it? That is really unclear, and I have to say, that feels like a pretty risky situation. All 3 men strong characters, all 3 of them fond of expressing their views, and all 3 of them probably also pretty hard to placate. In terms of that other union, though, the union between Scotland and the rest of the UK, well, yesterday Theresa May stood there and it was almost the first thing that she mentioned in her speech. She's clearly trying to look as if she's making it a priority, because her first visit as Prime Minister tomorrow will be to Edinburgh to have a meeting with Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister. So clearly that is really on her mind, and she means business when she says she wants to preserve the union.
So, if we think about where we were last night, 24 hours ago, we were talking here. What's happened in the meantime to make us a little more confident maybe about the kind of sense of Theresa May as Prime Minister?
We've had some very big pieces of the jigsaw today, and I think there are 3 main things really that she's done. Firstly, she has efficiently, clinically, some people might say quite brutally, cleared out a group of people who were seen, fairly or not, as a clique around David Cameron or George Osborne. They are gone, off to the backbenches. So there will be big characters, experienced politicians and strong voices on the backbenches, which might be a benefit, but again, that could be a real risk too. Secondly, she's found places around the cabinet table for what we might call the quiet grafters, people who've worked hard, who've done their jobs lower down in government or in other parts of the cabinet, who've been rewarded for loyalty and rewarded for hard work. But that means, I think too, round the cabinet table and in public life, we're going to see fewer characterful, colourful voices speaking from the cabinet, and maybe that tells us that Theresa May is very interested in controlling what is going on and having her authority stay intact. Thirdly, though, maybe most interestingly of all, if a lot of people were thinking Theresa May was going to be very, very cautious, it was all going to be about continuity, she's actually pretty much dismantled 3 government departments, taken bits away from each other and mixed them up, most notably and controversially perhaps, dismantling the Department for Energy and Climate Change. And that has sent what some people in the environmental world, remember David Cameron promised the greenest government ever, that set a few alarm bells ringing for some people. But I think, overall, the sense of Theresa May was of somebody who was most interested in stability, most interested in being a safe pair of hands. I think actually the strongest message we've had from inside Number 10 today is that she wants to draw a line under the Cameron era. She sees this time as her own.
Interesting. Again, Laura, thanks very much. Laura Kuenssberg there for us, our political editor. And that is it from Downing Street this evening. A lot of ministerial changes today, as Laura has been explaining. So a quick reminder that you can follow all the news of Mrs May's cabinet changes, along with reaction and analysis, Laura's blog and other things on BBC News website. That's bbc.co.uk/news, and all the links are there for you. And with that, it's time to join Rita for the day's other main stories.
Hugh, thank you. Thousands of people have attended the funeral of Philando Castile, who was shot dead by police in the US state of Minnesota last week. The killing led to protests and to nights of violence across the country. Policing in America is now being sharply questioned after a series of deaths of African Americans at the hands of officers. Our North America editor John Sopel went out on patrol with police in the city of Frederick in Maryland, and he sent this report.
Hi, what's your name?
The other side of policing in America.
Blue's got 2-color eyes.
Yeah.
In Frederick, Maryland, a city with its fair share of street gangs and drug problems, Officer Deborah Kidwell has gone to the park to meet local youngsters.
Do you want red?
She comes bearing gifts.
Hey, buddy, you want some bubbles?
But the first question this little one asks is, do you wear a gun?
I do. Just in case. Just in case I need it.
And perceptions are hard to shift.
All they think is that we lock people up and we shoot people, and that's their perception. They don't seem to understand that the majority of what we actually do is to help people.
I mean, have there been too many shootings?
Oh yeah, yeah. Absolutely. Go ahead.
But then a real call comes in. A domestic
That's right.
dispute across town. Policing in the US is under intense scrutiny, and the president has been at the forefront of saying things have to change.
Frederick Police! What's going on?
The police force here is seen as something of a role model in the way it engages with the community. A storm comes in, and one of the sources of rumbling discontent in Frederick and across the country is the ethnic makeup of the police. Here, it's 87% white, and the chief is desperately trying to change that, but it's proving difficult.
To attract the minority candidates, we're having a difficult time, just like every other law enforcement agency around the country.
How do you change that?
Every community meeting I go to, I usually talk about recruiting. You know, if you know somebody, yourself or maybe a family member that could be interested in this job, have them come on in.
Now, I need you to put out your cigarette. I need you to turn around, put your hands behind your back.
Back at the apartment after a long wait, the partner returns home and is promptly arrested. He's taken into custody, the woman put into sheltered accommodation. This is the mundane face of nearly all policing in the United States, a domestic dispute turned violent. It's the 0.1% of cases where lethal force is deployed that is doing such damage to the reputation of the police and race relations.
There's definitely a lot of mistrust, so I think that, you know, it's really important to get out there and to show people that we are not just a uniform, that we're human beings behind the badge with families and caring, and that, you know, that what we're doing is actually out here because we all want to help.
10 hours. But it's an uphill task. John Sopel, BBC News, Frederick, Maryland.
There are reports tonight of an incident taking place in Nice in France, where crowds are celebrating Bastille Day, the French national celebration, with fireworks. These pictures that we're just getting show people fleeing the scene. One news agency has reported that a vehicle has ploughed into the crowd at the end of the fireworks. An eyewitness has reported that there are several people lying injured in the street. Let's take a brief look now at some of the day's other news stories. Donald Trump, the Republican candidate in the US presidential election, is reported to have chosen a member of his party's right-wing Tea Party movement as his running mate. The Trump campaign hopes that Mike Pence, who's governor of Indiana, will help to attract socially conservative voters. The mother of a 13-year-old girl who was sexually abused by her father before her death has said she's angry and disappointed at a decision by the Crown Prosecution Service not to bring any charges. Poppy Worthington died in December 2012 after being found with serious injuries at her home in Barrow in Cumbria. The CPS said this morning that there was insufficient evidence to provide a realistic prospect of conviction. Prince Harry has been tested for HIV in a bid to raise awareness and to encourage others to do the same. According to the latest figures, there are thought to be around 18,000 people who are unaware that they have the virus. Prince Harry, who tested negative, said he took the step of being publicly tested to help tackle the stigma surrounding it. At least 200 million girls and women worldwide have undergone female genital mutilation. It's a practice now being described by the United Nations as child abuse. Kenya is one of the countries most affected. 1 in 5 between the ages of 14 and 49 have been cut. Our global health correspondent Tulip Mzumda has been to Kenya as it works to eradicate the practice. A warning: the piece contains a graphic description of FGM.
In front of you is the Selenke Girls Boarding Primary School, entitled
Determined and brave. Most of these girls ran away from home because they were about to be mutilated or forced to marry. In some tribes, the tradition where parts of a girl's vagina are removed marks the point a girl becomes a woman. It happened to this teenager when she was just 7 years old.
And it was so difficult. You feel like you want to faint, you want to cry, you want to do even running out that home.
2 years later, her father told her she must marry a man in his 60s. That's when she decided to escape. All of these girls risked their lives by running away, but here they have a future. They're getting an education and they're no longer at risk of being mutilated. And crucially, these girls won't go on to harm their own daughters. Agnes Pareo, who runs the Tassaru Rescue Centre and the school, is trying to stamp out the brutal custom in her ancient Maasai community. She introduced me to women in a nearby village, including a former cutter, who did a demonstration of what she used to do.
So this is the vagina here. So you scrape the side of the vagina, and take off the clitoris here.
It emerged the cutting used to happen right where we stood. It's difficult to imagine how terrifying this experience would be for a little girl.
Gosh, and she's screaming, I guess.
Yes, the girl is screaming.
Kenya banned female genital mutilation in 2011. The UN's Agency for Children says young girls are far less likely to be cut today, but old customs die hard.
This is a tradition that's very important to us, the Maasai people. Otherwise, the girls will want sex all the time. We are not allowed to do it anymore. Otherwise, I would cut my 7-year-old daughter until she bleeds a lot.
In these deeply traditional patriarchal communities, away from the big cosmopolitan cities, many men still demand that women are cut. But attitudes are changing, and these Maasai tribe cricketers are helping to lead the charge, refusing to marry any girl who's been cut.
We use it as a way to bring youth together, to bring the community together and tell them that female genital mutilation is not that important. In the long run, I believe it will have a change in society. Definitely it will happen in my lifetime, I know.
Tulip Mazumdar, BBC News, Nanyuki, Kenya.
And you can see and hear more about the issue of FGM across BBC News tomorrow on radio, TV and online. Golf now, and both Rory McIlroy and Justin Rose are well placed following their first rounds at the Open at Royal Troon. McIlroy is on 2 under par and Rose on 3 under par, 5 shots behind leader Phil Mickelson. The American had this shot to set the lowest ever first round score in a major tournament. He came agonisingly close but had to be satisfied with an 8 under 63, the joint lowest first round score. England's cricketers have made a steady start to the first test against Pakistan at Lord's. Newcomer Jake Ball took his first wicket as the visitors were limited to 77 for 3 at one stage, but it was the veteran batsman Misbah-ul-Haq who stole the show, hitting a century to help Pakistan recover to 282 for 6 at the close. The 42-year-old became the oldest player to score a century in the modern game, celebrating with some press-ups. There have been extraordinary scenes in the Tour de France today where the defending champion, the British cyclist Chris Froome, was forced to abandon his bike and start running up the mountain road. Froome had been knocked off after a pile-up involving a motorbike and spectators. Our sports correspondent Natalie Perks has the story.
The climbs of Mont Ventoux are intense enough without having to attempt them on foot.
The yellow jersey is running up the Tour de France.
But in farcical scenes, Chris Froome's desperation to retain the lead saw him turn triathlete, running bikeless up the mountain. It may have looked like a crowd pleaser, but Froome was far from pleased with the crowds. And this is why their desire to get in the faces of the riders meant a camera bike had to stop suddenly, sending Richie Porte and in turn Froome smashing headfirst into the back of it. By the time Froome was finally able to grab a usable bike, he'd already lost major ground on his rivals.
He gets a push from his mechanic.
Furiously shaking his head as he crossed the line. But with his dream of a third Tour win hanging in the balance, the jury decided the result shouldn't stand, leaving one very happy Froome to tweet, "Still in the yellow jersey." So Froome keeps his lead then, but perhaps not his patience with rowdy crowds. Natalie Perks, BBC News.
Well, just before we leave you, there's been some new images coming in on the breaking story which is happening in Nice in France tonight. There were reports that a vehicle drove into a crowd in Nice in France as the crowd celebrated Bastille Day. We have a number of images which I think we can't actually bring you at the moment, but one news agency has been reporting that a vehicle ploughed into the crowd at the end of the fireworks. An eyewitness has reported that there were several people believed to be injured lying in the street. Well, that's all for now. Next up is the news where you are. Good night.